I'll be discussing FDA, COVID-19, and the conduct of clinical trials. I have no conflicts of interest to report, and the views presented today are my own. The objectives of this talk include providing an overview of FDA efforts to support drug development during the COVID pandemic, focusing on non-COVID medical products that are regulated by the agency. I'll discuss changes in clinical trial conduct during the pandemic and consider future developments. And as a prominent example, I'll describe developments related to the use of digital health technologies. What I won't be emphasizing is summarized on this slide. As activities specifically addressing COVID, FDA has been reviewing pre-market investigational new drug submissions and requests for expanded access involving investigational drugs. Many activities have been consolidated in the Coronavirus Treatment Accelerator Program, or CTAP, with review to date of more than 600 development programs and more than 450 active trials of therapeutic agents for COVID. FDA has also reviewed requests for emergency use authorizations, with EUAs granted for monoclonal antibodies, an antiviral, drugs in shortage, and vaccines. In addition, FDA has issued guidance on various COVID-specific topics, such as developing drugs and biological products for treatment or prevention of COVID-19. What I will emphasize today are FDA's activities related more generally to COVID-19, such as developing guidance for industry, investigators, and institutional review boards related to addressing the impact of COVID-19 on research in general. Other activities involve conducting outreach, holding listening sessions, and soliciting feedback from stakeholders. The agency seeks to convey up-to-date information to the public, and FDA Centers for Drugs, Biologics, and Devices are working together in unprecedented ways. Arguably a centerpiece of these efforts is FDA guidance on the conduct of clinical trials of medical products during COVID-19, initially released in March of 2020 and updated multiple times through January of this year. As a core principle of the so-called clinical trials guidance, FDA emphasized that the safety of trial participants should be the paramount focus. After such safety is assured, protecting trial integrity and maintaining compliance with good clinical practice should be addressed. In addition, for specific questions that depend on factors such as the trial study population, type of investigational product, or endpoint, we suggested contacting the appropriate FDA review division. The same guidance also solicited inquiries on clinical trial conduct during the pandemic to a new dedicated mailbox at clinicaltrialconduct-COVID-19 at fda.hhs.gov. This mailbox has received and responded to more than 600 inquiries as of June 2021. Importantly, the guidance's question and answer appendix was intentionally developed to be expanded over time based on issues identified by the agency, as well as in response to inquiries received in the mailbox. So this approach helps to explain the multiple updates to the clinical trials guidance that I mentioned. To provide more insight into this process, FDA conducted an internal analysis several months into the COVID pandemic last year. This slide shows that industry and academia accounted for the majority of inquiries received, followed by questions from trial participants, CROs, and the other entities as shown. In terms of the focus of individual inquiries, COVID-19 related study questions were most common, and these were forwarded to the appropriate review division. The more general topics of how to interact with FDA, when was FDA going to issue more COVID-related guidance, what about investigational product distribution, and various other topics as shown, were reviewed by a multi-center working group with input from subject matter experts as appropriate. And these efforts were then turned into additional new Q&As in the guidance itself. The product of these efforts was an expanding question and answer appendix shown on this slide. The list of questions and answers was lengthened with each update, and the insert shows several topics added early on involving remote clinic visits for trials that had been on site, how to handle protocol deviations and amendments as the pandemic impacted trial operations, recommendations for shipping low-risk investigational products to home settings when patients were no longer traveling, and so on. Looking at one topic in greater detail, and while adhering to existing FDA regulations, this slide shows the FDA approach to certain remote study visits. Of note, changes to a protocol can be made without prior FDA review or approval if intended to eliminate an apparent immediate hazard, such as the risk of COVID infection. And when necessary, sponsors can conduct telephone or video visits as safety monitoring, for example, or implement changes immediately with subsequent review by the IRB and notification to FDA. These changes can be documented as protocol deviations until a corresponding amendment can be approved. This slide provides more detail on remote outcome assessments. Based on inquiries regarding whether to conduct clinical outcome assessments or COAs remotely, the guidance indicates that sponsors should consider if the remote technology is appropriate for the type of data capture involved. Sponsors should also consider ways to ensure consistency between in-person and remote assessments, and also adequately prepare investigators as well as develop procedures for technical support. FDA recognized that trial-related deviations and amendments due to COVID-related disruptions would be inevitable. Protocol deviations are generally reported to FDA in clinical study reports, whereas global changes to study conduct should generally be reported as a protocol amendment. During the rapidly evolving circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic, FDA understood that a sequence of changes might be needed and suggested, therefore, that consolidating several protocol modifications into a single protocol amendment would be acceptable. Home delivery may be appropriate for certain self-administered investigational products, as long as no additional safety risks are involved. In addition, requirements for storage conditions and product accountability must be met and documented. If home delivery is for only a limited number of trial participants, this approach can be done as a protocol deviation. If the change is more extensive, a protocol amendment would be required. Another inquiry focused on whether an investigational product intended for infusion can be administered locally. While recognizing that each specific situation will affect feasibility and appropriateness, as general recommendations for documenting oversight, investigators and sub-investigators should complete FDA Form 1572, whereas local providers, nurses, and phlebotomists can be documented in a responsibility log. Also, procedures should be used to assure product accountability and quality, including for the drug to be kept under appropriate storage conditions during delivery. An interesting question was, how do I obtain signed informed consent from a hospitalized patient who is in isolation when a COVID-19 infection control policy prevents us from entering the patient's room to collect a signed informed consent form? The guidance pointed out that traditional methods or electronic informed consent should be used when feasible, but other procedures could be used to still satisfy FDA's informed consent documentation requirements. Time doesn't allow for details to be discussed, but a method involving photos of the documents signed by the patient using a cell phone camera, or another method involving witness attestation was provided. This slide shows the most recent question and answer added to the guidance. It was noted that certain clinical trial protocols have an exclusion criterion for receipt of another investigational medical product. If a participant receives a vaccine or other medical product for the prevention or treatment of COVID-19 authorized under an EUA, would FDA consider this to be receipt of an investigational medical product? The guidance indicated that a medical product under an EUA isn't approved but is authorized for use in clinical care, and when used under an EUA is not considered an investigational product. If the same product is used in a clinical investigation under an IND, however, then receipt of the same product is considered investigational. Beyond these general concepts, specific scientific reasons may exist for exclusion or discontinuation criteria. Overall, in this guidance, we emphasize that it was important to document COVID-related changes to trial protocols, including any contingency measures taken and how they affected the entire trial, as well as individual participants. FDA recognized that there would be many protocol deviations, as well as increased missing data, and also that capture of some data would occur outside of protocol-defined windows. A specific recommendation was to document now so that clinical study reports could provide a listing of participants affected by the COVID-19 related study disruptions, along with a description of how participants' experience was altered. This slide on statistical considerations gives me a chance to highlight a companion guidance to the clinical trial conduct guidance. The content of this document was developed, quote, to help ensure that a trial can provide interpretable findings with the correct statistical quantification of uncertainty, given that statistics wasn't covered in the clinical trial conduct guidance. Shifting gears a bit, consistent with what I've described on the past series of slides, information presented publicly by the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative provides an independent perspective on the impact of the COVID pandemic. In summary, as shown on this slide, site-based visits and care for trial participants pre-COVID often became home-based visits and care during the pandemic. CDE documented this transition to remote virtual trial visits in a survey they conducted, with this slide showing examples of how such visits were conducted using various technologies and platforms. Given that part of the transition in clinical trial conduct involves digital health technologies, including sensors and software, I'll mention that DHTs, as they're called, were already changing clinical research even before COVID, but the pandemic has certainly changed things further. Digital health technologies are being used increasingly in settings involving both clinical trials and observational studies, actually. And for example, decentralized clinical trials, which use technology to communicate with study participants and to collect data, can offer advantages of faster enrollment and sustained participation in trials, greater convenience for participants, the potential for less missing data, and increased participant diversity. So whether focused on various types of monitoring, actigraphy, or other types of data as shown on this slide, the scope of digital health technology is certainly expanding rapidly. Representative potential uses of DHTs in clinical trials are shown here and include screening, enrollment, and enrichment, safety monitoring, evaluation of dose-effect relationships, and endpoint assessments, among other functions. We arguably have a lot to learn about optimal use of digital technologies, and sponsors can help answer questions such as, how appealing is a DHT to the potential user? Is it easy to put on and operate? Is the DHT feasible to wear for the required time period, including consideration of battery life? Additional questions are related to the syncing of data to become part of the trial record, and can a person bring their own device to a trial? An FDA-based example of digital health technology is the COVID My Studies app. Available as simply the My Studies app before COVID, the app is a web-based configuration portal that can collect real-world data. As a secure storage environment, it has been deployed in both randomized trial and real-world data settings as shown on this slide. And the name change to COVID My Studies reflected a new capability to obtain informed consent from COVID-infected patients who are in isolation. Having brought up real-world data, now let's consider that topic of RWD and COVID-19 on its own merits, starting with a few general pros and cons. For example, and as opportunities, real-world data accumulates steadily as the pandemic unfolded. Valid real-world evidence to inform pandemic response is certainly beneficial, and progress is often achieved by lessons learned. On the other hand, we should recognize that more data aren't automatically better. Challenges in diagnosing, treating, and reporting on a new disease in medical records or claims databases can create methodologic problems when analyzing drug outcome associations, and our understanding of COVID-19 is continually evolving. Overall, we might say that COVID-19 presents an opportunity to leverage real-world data to inform clinical and regulatory decisions, but scientific rigor must be maintained. As an example of evaluating real-world data at FDA involving COVID, the Evidence Accelerator represents a collaboration with the Reagan-Udall Foundation and Friends of Cancer Research to better understand COVID-19. The graphic on this slide shows that the accelerator sits between FDA and other government entities, and the figure also shows the intake of real-world data from data and technology partners. In one activity called parallel analysis, these external partners use a common protocol to conduct side-by-side analyses on various COVID-related topics. Another example of using real-world data is the FDA Cure ID app, which collects information on novel uses of FDA-approved drugs. This capability of evaluating new uses for old drugs represents an obvious opportunity during COVID-19, and more information is available on the website shown. Finally, it's important to note that FDA issued the clinical trial conduct and other guidance documents to assist sponsors in assuring the safety of trial participants, maintain compliance with good clinical practice, and minimize risk to trial participants for the duration of the public health emergency. As noted in the guidances, this policy is intended to remain in effect only for the duration of the public health emergency related to COVID-19 declared by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, but the lessons learned can be implemented going forward. Let's end with a question. Which of the following statements is false, the single best answer? A, ensuring the safety of trial participants is a core focus of the FDA COVID-19 clinical trial guidance. B, the FDA COVID-19 clinical trial guidance has been updated several times based on inquiries from the field. C, digital health technologies were being implemented before COVID-19 and have increased in use during the pandemic. Or D, all processes described in FDA guidance on COVID-19 will be inappropriate when the public health emergency ends. The correct answer, that is, the false statement, is D. All processes described in FDA guidance on COVID-19 will not necessarily be inappropriate when the public health emergency ends. I'll summarize the entire presentation by saying that FDA is working closely with stakeholders to provide guidance on clinical trial conduct during the COVID-19 pandemic and seeking to protect patient safety and promote trial integrity. The pandemic has certainly disrupted the conduct of clinical trials, such as increasing the use of remote trial procedures. And going forward, digital technologies and other approaches have the potential to change the way many clinical trials are conducted. With that, I'll leave one more mailbox address. This is the CDER Medical Policy Real-World Evidence address if any questions arise after this session. And with thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Concato. We have several questions coming in for you, and with that, if you're ready, we'll go ahead and get started. Our first question is the clinical trial conduct guidance mailbox still open?
Yes, thank you for the question. And the answer to the question is indeed yes as well. The mailbox that was on one of my earlier slides is still active if questions arise regarding clinical trial conduct during COVID. Obviously, we're in a different point in the pandemic now than when the initial questions and answers were developed, but nonetheless, actually, we have a Q&A being prepared as we speak that will be released in the coming weeks. But in general, staff from the Center for Drugs, the Center for Biologics, the Center for Devices, and other parts of FDA are ready to consider questions and prepare answers either one-on-one, or if the scope of the question is and the impact is judged to be of broad applicability, then it could indeed become yet another new question and answer in the appendix of the guidance as I described earlier. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Concato, for that great answer. So our next question is, how do the clinical trial guidance, conduct guidance, and the statistical considerations guidance relate to one another?
Thanks. Both documents were intended to help sponsors and stakeholders, obviously, in conducting and analyzing, respectively, trials during the pandemic. As hopefully was clear, the trials guidance is mainly focused on participant safety, trial integrity, and good clinical practice, whereas the statistics guidance was intended to help when the data had been collected, but trials have been affected by COVID in that the protocol cannot be followed, and obviously we understand why. In all cases, I might add, communication early and often with the division involved is highly recommended.
Wonderful, thank you. And it looks like we have a lot more questions coming in. If the audience would like to ask Dr. Concato a question, it's a very unique opportunity to be able to ask these questions, especially in light of recent events. And so we definitely want to give you that opportunity. You can put that in the Q&A chat pod right now. And we have a few more questions coming in. One is, Dr. Concato, does this situation lead to interesting reports in journal articles?
Thanks for the question. We hope so. Time at the margin is always limited, but on the other hand, we do think that the lessons learned in this unprecedented situation, unfortunately, I could say we hope we didn't have to learn them, but nonetheless we did. So that's something that we do have on our priority list. Thank you.
Great, thank you. It's helpful to learn about those priorities. And another question for you, do you foresee another shift in a trend to DHT in the post-COVID era?
Yeah, interesting question. As I think the slide on DHT alluded to, clearly there was movement, so to speak, in that space before COVID. And without being too speculative, I think the pandemic maybe helped to lessen what might be called inertia or hesitation, understandably so, in terms of trying things out. So I think we will never know exactly how COVID has impacted things, but to the extent that DHTs have been tested in different situations, I think a reasonably hedged answer would still be yes, that I think the devil's in the details and we have to figure out how to apply them appropriately and suitably, which was also on one of my slides. But thank you, and then time will tell. Let me stop there.
Great, thank you, Dr. Concato. And we actually just saw a comment in the question box, and he said that your team was very responsive when they had used the email box, and that the guidances were really helpful. So it's good to know that people are using this mailbox and finding it useful. So we have another.
Thanks very much. Yeah, do you have other questions? I'm having trouble following. It's great to see so many, but I'll defer to you.
Okay, great. Yeah. Another question for you. Will the flexibility shown by the FDA during the pandemic continue going forward?
Thanks. As one of my later slides showed, and one of the reasons we were able to release this guidance so promptly at the beginning of the pandemic was that we are only able to say that the guidance applies until the end of the public health emergency as declared by the secretary, et cetera. Now that sounds perhaps worrisome, as if we were approaching some sort of cliff that we have to worry about. But I would say that on the contrary, virtually all of the recommendations in the guidance are aligned with FDA regulations. In that sense, and again, if myself and others in the Office of Medical Policy, I'd like to think we contributed, but we were sort of the central hub for many subject matter experts, so to speak, at FDA who know the details of each and every regulation, each and every situation much better certainly than I do. But I would think that collectively we were more creative in our thinking, more so than literally flexible regarding regulations. We did not waive regulations even to figure out, I know it took a couple of pages of text, but how to get informed consent for a COVID patient who's in isolation using a smartphone camera and or other means. So the bottom line is, even after the public health emergency is declared ended, many of the approaches can continue as needed and as they are found to be useful. And although I just want to add one other thought, only because as I was going through the slides, it occurred to me, if there are any questions in particular, say about the FDA Cure ID app, which made me think of it because that's part of, that could be used as part of the approach to get informed consent when a typical procedure is not available. But please shoot an email. We have plenty of information on how that particular app can help in clinical research in general, and how it's being used in different settings, both in clinical trials and in so-called real-world data settings.
Great, thank you, Dr. Concato. And yeah, it looks like we have a few more questions coming in, and one that we're just seeing that came in, and it is, are there more guidances that may be coming out on DCT trials? And do you have any details on those or clarity about the qualifications and devices and using them in DCT?
Very good. I would say for official listings of guidances, I would refer folks to the CDER guidance agenda that is released regularly. But more broadly, and without so-called dangling a worm, I would say that we are very much attuned to developments in the field, whether it's on the clinical trial side of the landscape, where decentralized trials, digital health technologies are again, we're increasing in interest and use before COVID as well. I wear a couple of hats as I was introduced. I'm on the real world evidence side of CDER as well. And on that front, we are also in the process of guidances. So I know I'm sort of walking a fine line. I cannot really talk about guidances that aren't released yet, but I can point to general directions and as well for specifics. It's an easy Google search to look for CDER Guidance Agenda 2021. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Concato. Let's see, it looks like we have a question here about the future of the use of real-world data. If you had a crystal ball, what would you expect to happen?
Well, that was going to be my answer as well. You took the words out of my mouth. I wish I had a crystal ball, but no. This question gives me a chance to say that the FDA is committed to honoring with enthusiasm the mandate as per 21st Century Cures to evaluate the potential use of real-world data, real-world evidence. We are agnostic in the sense that if the data and the study design generate adequate evidence, then it doesn't matter per se where it came from. What matters is whether the design used and the data fit for purpose and the design was adequate. And only because this happened last week, I know we're running out of time, but I think it's a useful example to show the agnosticism, if you will, of FDA. It was last Friday that the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research approved a new indication for Prograf tacrolimus. It's actually the first time that a drug for lung transplantation has been approved, and that new indication was based on real-world data, real-world evidence from the U.S. Registry of Transplant Recipients as the adequate and well-controlled study. So that, I think, is, again, the standard of evidence was not lowered, but we were able to decide that the evidence was there. And I think that's a sign of the flexibility, excuse me, not the flexibility, but the open-mindedness, if you will, of the FDA in looking at all types of data. It has to be the right information at the right time for the right question. But in that sense, the future hopefully will be bright in the sense of adding real-world evidence to our toolkit. In no way, shape, or form are we suggesting that clinical trials will or should go away. Rather, we should be thoughtful and look for opportunities to use the best approach. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Concato. I'm sure it's hard to predict the future, but it's helpful to hear your insights on that. So with that, I think we are running out of time. If you want to take a look, if there is time for one more question, I'm not sure. I'll take a look at the clock, but I'm hearing from our AV team, I think we need to move on to our next presentation right now. And so with that, thank you, Dr. Concato. We appreciate your time and your insights. And